When a routine traffic stop turns into a career-defining moment, a police officer's worst assumptions collide with a truth he never saw coming. His target is the man who holds his future in his hands. The sun was starting its descent over the streets of Sacramento, painting the sky with streaks of gold and amber. Eric Porter was on his way home after a long day at the office. His sedan hummed softly as he adjusted the air conditioning, eager to shake off the day's stress. The radio played faintly in the background, a soothing antidote to the bustling city streets. He approached a yellow light slowing down just as it turned red. That's when the blue and red lights erupted behind him, accompanied by the sharp blare of a police siren. Eric glanced in his rearview mirror, his brows furrowing slightly. He pulled over to the side of the road, rolling down his window. As a police cruiser parked behind him, out stepped Officer Bradley Larson, mid-30s with a buzz cut and a badge gleaming on his chest. Larson adjusted his belt as he swaggered toward Eric's car, exuding the confidence of someone used to being in control. License and registration, Larson said curtly, his voice flat but laced with a hint of authority. Eric complied without a word, reaching into his glove compartment for his registration and handing over his driver's license. His movements were deliberate and calm, but he could feel Larson's gaze scrutinizing him as if searching for a reason to dig deeper. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson asked, leaning closer to the window. "I'm not entirely sure," Eric replied evenly, his tone polite but firm. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Larson said, though there was a flicker of hesitation in his voice. Eric frowned but nodded slightly. "I see. I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Larson didn't respond immediately. Instead, he lingered, his eyes narrowing as he studied Eric more closely. It wasn't just a routine stop anymore, at least not for Larson. His posture shifted subtly but noticeably, as if he had already decided this was more than a minor infraction. The officer glanced at the license in his hand. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked. Eric hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying, "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Larson wasn't really listening. His questions were starting to take on an edge, just enough to suggest that he wasn't concerned about a traffic violation anymore. Eric's calm demeanor seemed to work him, and he leaned in closer. "Where were you headed in such a hurry, just going home?" Eric replied. His tone remained steady, but the subtle shift in the air was impossible to ignore. Larson didn't just see Eric as a driver anymore. He saw something else. Something that warranted suspicion. Eric could sense the tension building, but he didn't flinch. Little did Officer Larson know the calm exterior wasn't naivety, it was control. This was just the beginning. Larson took a step back, folding Eric's documents with an exaggerated slowness, before tucking them into his chest pocket. He straightened up his expression, shifting into something faintly smug, as though he'd already made up his mind about the man sitting in front of him. "Step out of the car for me." Larson ordered. Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened briefly, but his face betrayed no reaction. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, his tone measured. Larson's lips twitched, but he masked it quickly. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The threat hung in the air, unspoken yet unmistakable. Eric exhaled slowly and opened the door as he stepped out. Larson's eyes flicked over him, sizing him up. Eric stood a little taller than the officer, his shoulders broad, but his demeanor unthreatening. His tailored suit suggested professionalism. His polished shoes hinted at someone meticulous and careful. Yet none of that seemed to matter. Larson gestured toward the front of the car. "Hands where I can see them." Eric complied, his movements calm and deliberate. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" Officer Larson smirked faintly. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful." Eric turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Larson. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else?" The question landed like a punch, and for a moment Larson's composure faltered. He straightened up, his hand drifting toward his belt, more reflex than necessity. "Watch your tone," he said, his voice hardening. I'm simply asking a question. Eric replied. There was no defiance in his voice, just a quiet firmness that seemed to unsettle the officer. Larson leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. You seem awfully familiar with how this works. You got something to hide. Eric let the silence stretch for a beat before answering. No, officer. I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency. You know, Larson scoffed but didn't reply. He stepped back, pacing a small circle in front of the car. The dynamic was shifting in ways he couldn't quite grasp. Eric wasn't reacting the way most people would. There was no fear, no stammering, no nervous fidgeting. Instead, there was control poise and an unsettling calm that put Larson on edge. You seem pretty confident. Larson muttered almost to himself, like you think you know what's going to happen next. Eric didn't rise to the bait instead. He tilted his head slightly. Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is. Larson froze for half a second before turning back to face him. The smoke was gone, now replaced by something sharper, almost defensive. He opened his mouth to reply, but the words didn't come out. Eric's composure was throwing him off balance, and he didn't like it. As the silence stretched, the tension between them felt electric, and Larson was starting to realize this wasn't going to play out the way he'd expected. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. The real test was about to begin. Larson tapped his fingers against the holster on his belt, his frustration barely concealed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked like Eric. His gaze flicked back to the sedan as though searching for a justification he hadn't yet manufactured. Turn around and place your hands on the hood, Larson said. His voice clipped. I need to check for weapons. Eric raised an eyebrow. Weapons, he repeated, his tone incredulous but still measured. Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon? Larson's jaw tightened, and for a moment his composure cracked. I'm not going to ask you again. Eric hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. Then without a word, he turned and placed his palms flat against the hood of his car. Larson approached the crunch of his boots on the asphalt. Breaking the uneasy silence, the officer patted Eric down in quick, rough movements, his hands lingering a little longer than necessary. It wasn't just a search. It was an attempt to assert dominance to provoke a reaction. But Eric didn't flinch, didn't stiffen, didn't so much as shift under the invasive scrutiny. You're clean, Larson muttered. Stepping back, the admission sounded begrudging, like he was irritated that he hadn't found anything to justify his suspicion. Eric turned to face him, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. Of course I am, he said simply now. Officer, if you're done, I'm not done. Larson, interrupted his voice, rising slightly. The words tumbled out too quickly, betraying his need to stay in control. You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why? Eric folded his arms. His posture relaxed, despite the tension crackling between them. I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement, he said. Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years. Larson's eyes narrowed. That, so you a lawyer or something? Eric smiled faintly. Or something. The ambiguity in his answer seemed to irritate Larson further. He stepped closer, invading Eric's personal space, his voice dropping to a near growl. Listen, you think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this? Eric met his gaze evenly, unflinching. I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness, and so far I'm not seeing much of it here. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Larson took the bait. Fairness. You think fairness is what this is about? People like you. Always. He stopped himself abruptly, the words lingering like smoke. Even though they hadn't fully escaped, Eric's expression didn't change. But something about his posture shifted, a subtle but unmistakable signal that he'd caught exactly what Larson had left unsaid. People like me. Eric repeated, his voice soft but charged with meaning. Larson bristled, stepping back as if realizing he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. You know what I mean, he muttered, though his tone lacked the conviction it had moments earlier. I think I do. Eric replied quietly. His calmness wasn't passive anymore. It was razor-sharp, cutting through the pretense like a blade. And I think we both know this interaction stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago. Larson opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come for the first time. He looked uncertain, like he wasn't entirely sure how to proceed. The balance of power was shifting, and for the first time Larson was on shaky ground, but the moment of reckoning was still to come, and it would be one he'd never forget. Eric's voice broke the heavy silence, steady and unyielding. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Larson's brows knitted, his irritation resurfacing. "I don't care who you are." He shot back, though. The faint crack in his tone suggested otherwise. Eric reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said calmly, watching Larson's hand twitch near his holster. "No need for theatrics. I want you to see it." The words hung in the air, weighted with something unspoken. Larson's eyes followed Eric's hand as he pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. Eric Porter Eric said, his tone as casual as if he were introducing himself to a neighbor head of Internal Affairs Sacramento Division. Larson froze his eyes, darted to the badge, then back to Eric's face, searching for some sign that this was a joke. But there was no humor in Eric's expression, only quiet authority and a trace of disappointment. "Internal Affairs," Larson repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes," Eric cut in, sparing him the effort of finishing the sentence. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that anyone wearing this badge upholds the integrity and values it represents." Larson's face went pale. His confident stance began to falter in real time. He stepped back slightly, his hand slipping away from his belt, as if the weight of his own authority had suddenly become too much to carry. Eric stepped forward, closing the distance that Larson had unconsciously created. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Larson?" he asked, his voice calm but cutting. Larson didn't respond. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd wandered into quicksand and didn't know how to get out. "It's not the profiling," Eric continued, "though that's bad enough. It's not even the needless escalation. It's the fact that you did all of this without even knowing who you were talking to. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're supposed to uphold. And why?" Larson opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Eric's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "Because I didn't fit your idea of someone who deserves respect," he said, finishing the thought for him. His tone wasn't angry, but every word struck like a verdict. "And that's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for everyone you deal with in that uniform." Larson's shoulders dropped slightly under the weight of Eric's words. He glanced down at the badge in Eric's hand, as if hoping it might vanish if he didn't look too closely. Eric stepped back, giving him space to breathe, but his tone stayed sharp. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next." Larson's lips parted. He hesitated, clearly caught between pride and protocol. That pause was enough. "And you're going to hear from me again," Eric added, voice quieter but even more resolute. "Not as a driver you pulled over on the side of the road, but as the man who decides whether you're fit to wear that badge." Larson swallowed hard, his face reddening as the full reality set in. Slowly, he reached into his chest pocket and pulled out Eric's license and registration, his hands trembling slightly as he handed them back. Eric took them silently, tucking them into his wallet. He walked to the driver's side door, one hand on the handle. Then he paused, looking back over his shoulder to meet Larson's eyes. Larson met Eric's gaze one last time. "Remember this, Officer Larson," Eric said. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." As Eric slid back into his car and started the engine, Larson stood motionless in the fading light, his confidence shaken, his future uncertain. But for Eric, this was far from over. His next move would send ripples through the entire department. The drive home was quiet. Eric's mind wasn't. The encounter replayed in his head, Not because it was rare, but because it wasn't. Larson wasn't the first officer Eric had confronted like this, and he knew he wouldn't be the last. But this time things were different. This time, Eric had the authority to act. The next morning, Eric sat at his desk, early sunlight cutting through the blinds of his office at the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. A file lay open in front of him. Officer Bradley Larson. The record wasn't clean. Minor complaints, unprofessional behavior, excessive stops. Nothing serious enough to spark real discipline, at least not until now. Eric leaned back in his chair, fingertips pressed together, deep in thought. Larson wasn't the problem, he was the symptom. And Eric wasn't interested in patching bullet wounds with band-aids. A knock broke his concentration. His assistant, Linda, stepped in with a stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Porter. I've got the summary of last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded, taking the files. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels this afternoon? There's something I need to talk to him about." She paused, catching the serious note in his voice. "Of course," she said quietly, then slipped out. Eric turned back to Larson's file, but his attention wasn't just on one man. It was on the system, the culture that let someone like Larson feel entitled to act the way he had. And if there was one thing Eric knew, it was this. Culture doesn't start in the patrol car. It starts at the top. That afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in a quiet conference room. Daniels, a seasoned leader with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense manner, leaned back in his chair, listening as Eric described the traffic stop. "I could have chalked it up as just another bad encounter," Eric said, his voice calm but unwavering. "But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't a one-off. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Daniels exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. Exhaling slowly, Daniels admitted, "This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up. We've always handled it internally, quietly." "And that's the problem," Eric replied. "Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. It's time to be loud." Daniels looked at him, the weight of the moment written across his face. "What are you proposing?" "A department-wide review," Eric said without hesitation. "Not just of individual officers, but of our training, our protocols, our accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Daniels leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this." "Good," Eric said simply. "It's about time someone did." The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and reports. Eric worked relentlessly, gathering data, speaking with officers, holding public forums to hear directly from the community. The Larson incident became a catalyst for change, a turning point that forced the department to face its flaws head-on. Larson, for his part, faced an internal hearing. Eric didn't hide his involvement. He sat directly across from Larson during the proceedings, watching as the officer squirmed under the weight of accountability. The result? A suspension. But Eric knew the real victory wasn't in punishing Larson, it was in preventing the next Larson. Months later, Eric stood at the podium at a community event. The room was filled with officers, city officials, and local residents. He didn't speak of blame, he spoke of responsibility, of the shared duty to build a system that worked for everyone. His words weren't just a call for reform, they were a promise. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," Eric said, his voice strong and clear. "It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter. That's the badge I believe in, and that's the badge we're building together." The applause was thunderous. But Eric didn't dwell on it. For him, this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a better one. As he stepped down from the podium, he looked out at the crowd, some skeptical, some hopeful, but all listening. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come. And for now, that was enough. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's start the conversations that matter, the ones that lead to real change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us what we're capable of when we stand for what's right.